heavy rainfall in the city of Lagos, Nigeria's financial capital, this Monday to kick off a brand new business and market week. So it's going to be a lot of vehicular tsunami all over the city today with this very heavy downpour. So you expect traffic to be very sluggish. The go-slows will be a lot of flooding across the city. So this is what we're waking up to today to start the business week. Welcome to the program, everybody. I am Bosun Damafaye. We're live to you from Channel's global headquarters here in the city. Let's get the show started. The big story, just like the big rainfall, has to do with the country's first quarter GDP growing but sluggish in the first 3 months of this year. So let's show you the numbers as they come in very quickly before we bring in analysts both in Lagos and in Abuja to take us through what their thoughts are as far as the numbers are concerned. That's what we printed in the first quarter, 2.01%, lower than 2.38% in the last quarter of 2018. That's the figure there. In Naira terms, that's what you see on your TV screen. At the bottom left, 31.79 trillion Naira. Real GDP, 16.42 trillion Naira for the first quarter. Roll that over and give us a very quickly where we go. Let's run this through, gentlemen, as quickly as possible. Then we can have our go. This is how some of the sectors that contributed to the GDP. The big boys to the 2.01 GDP numbers were basically ICT, which grows very strong. Agriculture was a very sterling performer, 3.17%. Transportation and storage, trade and construction. Manufacturing went down, well, significantly from where it was in the last quarter. In the last quarter of last year, Nigeria's manufacturing was 2.35% by GDP. In the first 3 months of this year, that went down to 0.81%. That's quite significant decline there. It's even much lower than the third quarter of 2018. So Nigeria's industrial or manufacturing sector is actually in the water, technically speaking, as we speak. Then you go to the oil sector, which was also sank lower to negative 2.40%, was lower by 1.62% in the last quarter of last year, but went much lower to 2.40%. Non-oil sector grew 2.47% in the first quarter, a little bit lower, a tad lower than 2.70% in the fourth quarter of last year. So these are the brass tacks, as you call it, starting the GDP numbers. Let's get in our guest here to give us some sense of these numbers and what it actually means for Buhari's administration. They'll be getting a second inauguration next week. So let's talk to Paul Alaje, who is standing by at our Abuja studios, and of course at the Nigerian Stock Exchange. We have Michael Famoroti, who is a partner at Steers Business. Morning, gentlemen. Michael, it's good to have you on the program.
Morning. It's a pleasure to be here as always.
Great. Thank you so much. Hope you had a very nice weekend. Michael, let's chew the headlines, as it were. Break it down for us. What does it tell you with our GDP coming in at a growth of 2.01%, but lower than 2.38% in Q4?
Yeah, thank you, Boston. I think you've done one bit of the analysis for me in comparing it to the previous trend. But I also compare it to Q1 of 2018, which I think GDP grew by about 1.8%. So 2019 is slightly better, but nothing to get too excited about, obviously. I think the other key things to look at are how this quarter performed in comparison to what we expected. Personally, I was looking forward to GDP growth around 2.5%. I know the average across Bloomberg surveyed people was about 2.45%. So generally, the actual number came in below what markets was expecting. The other key thing to analyze really is the impact on the population. We know that our population growth is somewhere between 2.5% and 3%. So naturally, GDP growth of 2% is way below that. And again, for another quarter, we are essentially getting poorer as a country. And I think that's really the takeaway, to be honest.
Okay, in terms of the aggregate numbers, Michael, the MBS says, it says, and I'm quoting here, it is worth noting that the general elections, which was held across the country in Q1, stronger performance despite the elections. If you look at the aggregate GDP, 31.794 trillion naira in nominal terms. In the real GDP, you know, so if you look at these numbers, and you look at the first quarter, you look at the entire violence, the spate of violence on a daily basis in north central, northeast, and a bit of that in the northwest. Do you think printing 2.01% in first quarter this year was quite good? Of course, much higher than the Q1 of 2018.
I don't think it's that good. That said, I think there are some silver linings. I point to agriculture in particular, which grew, I think, 3.7%. That is way beyond growth posted throughout 2018. We recall that in 2018, we began to see the effect of the violence that you mentioned in the Middle Belt region. And I think that sector is beginning to recover. Q1 is normally a weak year for the sector as well. So the fact that growth still came in at 3.7% bodes well for the rest of the year. So I think the agricultural sector is a real bright spot. Beyond that, like you mentioned, I think telecoms has been, you know, propping services up for quite a while. And it's very interesting, obviously, in light of the listing we had last week. But beyond these big sectors, you know, you look around the economy from real estate to trade to the oil sector, and there's not much to celebrate, to be honest.
Okay, look at manufacturing, which was a massive slowdown to just around 1%, 0.81% from a massive 2.35% in the fourth quarter last year. How did we start the year on a very sluggish note, despite the PMIs pointing to what you call a higher or better reading? Now the GDP is out. It shows that manufacturing was, in the first quarter was largely underwater, or in the water at least.
Yeah, personally, I don't look at PMI numbers anymore. I think as a leading indicator of outputs in industry, it hasn't really been a fair gauge, right? Just like you've pointed out. The trend for industry, really, for me, looking at the numbers, was driven by two things. One is, if you look at the big boys in the sector, like food and beverages, textiles, for the last couple of quarters, they've been picking up quite well, you know, growth between 3 to 5%. This quarter, growth in those sectors really came in below 2%, and it signals sort of a slowdown in the pace of growth for me. But the other thing that really dragged down industry was refining of oil. I think the GDP of that sector fell by over 20% this quarter, and we know that the output there is very volatile. We know it's very vulnerable to the performance of the refineries, and that is essentially creeping up in the GDP figures.
Okay, so in terms of the manufacturing, do you think the entire Apapa messy roads and what have you, the very long delay, the higher costs of getting containerized goods in and out of the ports by exporters and importers who need manufacturing inputs and all of that, beginning to bite home very badly in our manufacturing GDP numbers?
The way I would look at it, I would consider the port constraints as a structural issue. I don't think it can explain why GDP growth was slower this quarter, but it does explain why we're talking about GDP growth of 1%, 2%, and 3% in an economy with such a weak manufacturing base, where it should be easy to be growing 25% a year, right? But the structural issues with the ports, with FX, with the fact that a lot of raw materials are imported, those are the kind of things that constrain the potential of the manufacturing sector. And they've done so for many years, and until we resolve them, I don't see that changing, you know, in the next 2 or 3 years either.
Are you Michael, are you enthused by the non-oil sector GDP 2.47% in real terms during the reference quarter? Yeah, Michael. Michael, my question is this: are you happy with the 2.7% non-oil sector GDP in the Q1? Okay, I think let's bring in Paul Alaje, who is a senior economist at SPA Professionals from Abuja Studios. Good morning, Paul. Thank you so much. It's been very nasty windstorm, rainfall here in Lagos this morning, so please apologize. We have a bit of a constraint technically on the audio there. You can hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, so let's get you to bite into the latest GDP numbers. What's your first bite?
Yeah, first, we see that growth, the GDP has grown slowly. It's a bit slower than what we had in the last quarter, from 2.38 now to 2.01%. And looking at it critically, we saw that the impact might have come from fall in agriculture, oil, and also in mining. But while we see some appreciable increase in some of the sector, it means that the sectors that could have influenced the GDP figures might have reduced or might have fallen for one or two reasons, which I think in the course of conversation we might look at. But the interesting thing to me is that Nigerian GDP seems to be having shape from the first quarter of 2015. And if you take our mind back to the first quarter of 2015, we have a fall in the GDP, which is negative growth, above 13% first quarter. First quarter of 2016 took the same shape, minus 13%. I'm talking about quarter on quarter. And when you look at first quarter of 2017, negative shape, negative growth. First quarter of 2018, negative growth. And of course, as expected, first quarter of 2019 had negative growth, impact of the election, postponement of elections, etc., etc. Now, because elections are over, now we are feeling the impact first on our GDP because some Saturdays were cancelled. People should have traveled. You know, there was a bit of confusion during the elections. We're getting the impact directly in millions, billions of dollars. Nigeria GDP has left the region of $400 billion, $400+ billion to about $375 billion, according to the new release, impact of which Nigerians may fare in the coming period.
But the MBS says the aggregate GDP was 31.74 trillion naira in nominal terms. So despite the elections and what have you, by naira figure, this was big.
Yeah, I agree with that. But when you compare that with what is going, if you compare the Nigeria GDP figures at the global level, naira becomes irrelevant at that time. So you look at what we did the last time and what we are doing now. From the figures available from the same organization, the GDP figure in USD in billion is 404.7, and right now what we are doing is 375.77 billion US dollars. That is reduction when you compare the two together. You see that Nigeria is currently doing 375.77 compared to what we did. And of course, from the GDP figure, the real GDP figures last year on year compared to this year on year, it's a reduction that we had of 2.01%.
Okay, so look at the sweet side of this, a bit of a bitter sweet, a bit of green and a bit of red apple, all coming together like that. Agriculture, transportation and storage, trade and construction, ICT were what the MBS or Statistics Office called the poster boys of the fourth quarter GDP. In real terms, non-oil sector contributing 0.86% to the GDP. Are you enthused with that number?
Yeah, it's good that non-oil sector is driving the new report we have, because when you look at oil sector, it's actually reduced in growth. I think it's actually a negative growth. But the non-oil sector, particularly if you break it down to utility, etc., you see that I'm happy with what we have. But I believe it could have been better if we had gotten our elections correctly. Knowing fully well that the oil sector, we don't have so much influence to control what happened in oil sector. Our output has also reduced on the average by 0.02 compared to what we had in the last quarter. So we have to fall back on what non-oil sector has to give to us. So we need to put more attention, particularly on agriculture, mining, manufacturing. Some of them did pretty much better than what we had in the first quarter, but I think we can do more by focusing more attention on them and providing necessary support and environment that we need for the non-oil sector of our GDP to grow.
A very quick question, Paul. Do you think with this higher contribution of non-oil sector GDP, 2.47% for non-oil sector, oil sector dipping sharply to a contraction of 2.40%, if you look at that, do you think Buhari's administration is trying to turn the corner from oil-based economy to non-oil-based? Do you think the ship, the behemoth, is beginning to make a turn, albeit very slowly, perhaps becoming a little bit discernible?
Please, can you repeat that?
I'm trying to ask that. If you look at the non-oil GDP, 2.47% growth, and the oil sector, a contraction, that is a negative 2.40%. So this is a two contracting position. So do you think the Buhari's administration is beginning to make a dent in trying to turn the economy to diversify from oil to non-oil?
Yeah, I strongly think that the administration should focus more on what we can control compared to what we cannot control. As some persons will call it diversification. If that is what we call it, is fine. But for me, I think for us to know which one is performing better, it could have been that there is no difference. Oil sector grew, but non-oil sector grew better than oil sector. At that point, we can say that, yes, we are receiving or we are getting the gains from diversification. But what we have now is a fall in in oil output. While we might not see significant difference in rate, of course, there were some differences in rate, but significant difference in rate or output might have not been felt. And you know that price multiplied by output gives us the volume of revenue that we have generated from oil sector. So the focus should be on non-oil sector. Transport, how do we intensify our effort on rail systems so that most of our goods and people can move from one point to another, which I think is the drive for the government. Government needs to intensify this right now. We need to consider real estate and housing. How do we reduce housing gap? All of this by providing solutions to our problems, because our problems are what looks at the test that we can derive our testimony from. The miracles of Nigerian prosperity will not come from abroad. It will come by solving our problem one after the other. Okay. The good news is that most of these problems are domesticated in non-oil sector, from housing to mining to agriculture, etc., etc. Okay. These, I strongly believe, if the administration will focus on intensify effort on all of these, then the kind of Nigeria we want to see might not be very far from us.
Paul, just a quick one. We're going to have you stand by into the second part of the program. But quickly, let's touch base with Michael Famoroti of our partner with Steers. Paul, sorry, Michael. This is coming to the motion picture, sound recording, music production. GDP was better, 1.13% in first quarter from 0.55% in fourth quarter, and even much better than the negative 0.45% in Q3. Does this also show that this music production, theater, sound recording, whatever, motion pictures, that this is good, it is beginning to work a little bit, that this non-oil sector, or what you call the entertainment industry, is beginning to show some force? Michael. Okay, I guess Michael, we lost Michael there. Okay, let's I'll come back to everyone after the break. We'll continue the conversation in a few minutes. The GDP numbers is out. We have a few sweet spots. Oil sector, a contraction of 2.40%. Non-oil sector grew significantly, grew much better, 2.47 against the oil sector. All of that we're putting together. Agriculture was good. Manufacturing, this way. 2 minutes, we'll continue the conversation.